Good morning, everyone. If I could ask you to help yourself to breakfast and take seats wherever they are open. We have a number of other people who are coming, but those of us who have lived in Washington know how just even 3 drops of rain can turn everything upside down, that or the Pope, but he's already left. So I thank you. My name is Joelle Attinger, and I'm president of the European Institute. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to this morning's discussion on WRC-15 and what is at stake. This is a meeting that we are doing, I'm very happy to say, in cooperation with the International Telecommunications Satellite Organization, ITSO. And I want to take the time to personally thank Jose Toscano, who is the Director General, Patrick Masambu, who is the Deputy Director General, and Renata David for their engagement in the work of the European Institute, and particularly on all issues regarding ITU and WRC. You have really been vital partners for the Institute, and we thank you. We have absolutely top-notch panel gathered for you today. You have the biographies of all the participants, so I will refer you to them so we can get started. But I do want to thank Clovis Batista, Senior Advisor for the Inter-American Telecommunications Commission, CTEL, for joining us, Ambassador Decker Anstrom, who is head of the U.S. delegation to WRC-15. Welcome back to the European Institute, Mr. Ambassador. Andrea Glorioso, who is the Counselor for the Digital Economy and Cyber at the delegation of the European Union here in Washington. Leslie Martinkovich, who is Director of International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Verizon. And we're very fortunate that Patrick has agreed to moderate this discussion. I also want to take a quick moment to thank Paul Brigner of the Internet Society. They will be live streaming this discussion. So welcome again, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you. Jose?
Thanks, Joelle. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. Let me, on behalf of ITSO, welcome you to this roundtable on WRC-15 that is being held in cooperation with the European Institute as part of our institutional cooperation aimed at addressing key issues confronting the telecommunications industry. We are particularly pleased that you have all made the time to attend, and of course, our special thanks to the European Institute for putting all of this together. For us at ITSO, this roundtable provides an opportunity to contribute to meeting the global need for creation of awareness about satellite technology and its vital role in enhancing, expanding access to communications. But even more importantly, in terms of timing as well as participation, we feel particularly excited that it was possible to arrange these discussions in the middle of intense global preparations for WRC, which is due to start in a month's time. Indeed, deciding to hold this roundtable, there were 2 primary objectives. Firstly, to provide a platform for sharing knowledge, expectations, and understanding amongst ICT policymakers, regulators, operators, and other key stakeholders about major issues at stake at the upcoming WRC-15. Secondly, to continue to contribute to building a common approach on key issues for both the satellite and mobile industries, taking into account their unique complementarity in serving mankind ICT needs. Clearly, these are important questions for all of us, especially when we consider the rapid advances in ICT industry, with increased competition, the growth of the internet, and the demand for connectivity being driven by smartphones, tablets, and innovative applications. All of these advances point to the need for policymakers and regulators to determine what policies are appropriate, if and how best to regulate new technologies, existing infrastructures, new services, new applications, and so on. Against this background, today's roundtable will be particularly relevant as it will explore some of these questions, including the resulting impact, especially on the deployment on universal broadband services. Let me just spend, I'm coming from the International Telecom Satellite Organization. I have to spend some minutes on satellites. You'll not be surprised. Satellites have played, you were expecting it, right? Satellites have played a long-standing and vital role in extending necessary communications to remote and rural areas, as well as providing capacity for terrestrial networks and terrestrial operators in need of backhaul services. They have also had an indispensable role in providing a redundant link when primary telecommunication networks are down or cable services are disrupted. Of course, no description of the importance will be complete without mentioning the value of satellite when disaster strikes. Communications are an essential component to disaster relief, not only for relief workers, but also for the civilian population which is affected. The first technology reached for under this type of urgent conditions is satellite. Satellite phones, mobile broadband terminals, media uplinks, military and first responder connectivity for situational awareness and logistics, as well as restoration of cellular and fiber links, all rely on satellite. Today, many in the satellite industry and satellite world are excitedly turning their attention to the new and powerful satellite broadband systems and applications that are currently being introduced in the marketplace. Satellites have traditionally played a significant role in providing needed infrastructure, and they will continue to do so in the future. Now, there are also new direct-to-home satellite internet services, greater deployment of VSAT networks, and new Ka-band systems under deployment. So, enough about satellites. Just 1 minute now about ITSO. As you know, the International Telecommunications Satellite Organization, known by the acronym ITSO, is the global intergovernmental organization with a membership of 149 countries, which is headquartered here in Washington, D.C., and which resulted from a restructuring where we created a private company called Intelsat. Intelsat, as you know, is currently registered in Luxembourg, and we are charged with ensuring that the privatized Intelsat meets several public service obligations, including continue to offer public telecommunication satellite services and maintaining global connectivity and coverage. These obligations are enshrined in a legal document between ITSO and the company Intelsat, which is called the Public Service Agreement. Recognizing the importance of broadband access to countries and the importance of satellites, we at ITSO, we see our role as one of a facilitator between our member states, their regulators, and the satellite community. In that regard, we hope that this roundtable will prove useful in continuing an important dialogue between policymakers, regulators, and satellite operators and their service providers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, and I wish you a very successful roundtable. Thank you.
A very good morning to all of you, distinguished colleagues. We have had already the introductions made by Joel. Let me just say that on behalf of ITSO, in addition to what Jose has said, we want to welcome you to this session. My name is Patrick Masambu, and I'll be serving as your moderator for this morning. We have a panel of distinguished speakers, and I will not go back in introducing them one by one, but I think what is important is to point out that there's a thread across all of them that brings speciality, which is very rare. Talking about Ambassador Armstrong, I think the fact that he was the head of the US delegation to the last WRC-15 speaks volumes in terms of being able to bring our memories to what happened and what we expect, and perhaps even for WRC-19. He will have spanned across a decade of what happens within the spectrum industry. So we are excited, Ambassador, to see you come to share your thoughts with us. Executive Secretary Clovis, as you know, has been with the CTEL for the last 15 years, and I can assure you 15 years is not a short time. So obviously, within that time, as he leaves CTEL now to go into the private sector, he will be able, and I understand today is his last day at CTEL, he will be able to tell us a lot of things that he has learned that you need to know about as you prepare for a conference like this. And as you know, CTEL also has membership of US, so it will be interesting to hear from him what his views are within the organizational setup. Andrea, as the Chancellor for Digital Economy at the European Union, I think will bring issues to the table that some of us may not be able to connect with immediately in terms of what has cyber crime to do with spectrum. How do they relate to one another? I think the inciting thoughts that you give to us will help us understand how you can match the picture between normal service requirements and what you have to do with relationship to cyber security. And then, of course, finally but not least, Leslie, as a policymaker from the mobile industry, I think has had well over 15 years, close to 20 now, of involvement in these cycles of WRC. And so when you have people like we have at the panel, I believe today will be a very worthwhile day for us to be able to have attended this session. We'll be expecting something like 10, 15 minutes per speaker, and that will give us about an hour. At the end of that, we then have questions. Perhaps I would suggest that we wait until we finish the presentations so that you are able to sometimes maybe save time. Who you may want to ask at that time a more rounded question as opposed to asking each speaker after every presentation. So that's what we are hoping for. In terms of overview, of course, as you know, WRC is held once every 3 or 4 years, more 4 than 3. And the last one was in 2012. It's organized by the ITU, and ITU, as you may be aware, has more than 190 member states. But of course, it also has members of industry, associates, international organizations, and so on. So the meeting that will be held in Geneva starting end of October, beginning of November, will bring across more than 3,000 delegates. Every country tends to attend WRC. I think WRC even tends to be attended more than the Plenipotentiary Conference, if I'm not mistaken. And that in itself is a challenge, because when you bring people who are technical and everybody thinks they are an expert in their area and ask them to agree on common issues, it is indeed a challenge. The number of items which will be discussed as agenda items, there are only about 10, but they are broken into sub-agenda items. So in totality, you have close to 27 items, what you may call as agenda. And these go across a whole broad coverage in terms of spectrum allocation to mobile service on a primary basis, identification of bands for IMT, public protection and disaster relief, UAS, provisions related to ASOMPs, and items for preparation for WRC-19 also will be discussed at this particular WRC-15. If I may hazard a risk, or I may risk to say, I think there may be 3 or 4 key agenda items where there will be a lot of discussion. But let me not go into that without having to give the panelists the chance to talk to the issues first. In terms of evidence of the key items, I think that can be seen across the common proposals that have been submitted to the ITU today. When you look across and see what each of the different regions have submitted to the ITU, you can see a focus, and a focus on some specific items, because regions want to be on record for what they believe in. And so the proposals, when you see common proposals, much as they may also reflect an area of convergence in a region, they also reflect an area of importance. To my mind, I think common proposals reflect a very clear direction in terms of issues that we need to focus on. But again, that's my opinion. Obviously, it could be wrong. If we could now start with our first speaker, Clovis, to give us your thoughts. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, Mr. Moderator, my dear friend Patrick Massambo, my dear friend José Toscano, Renata Brazil. I'd like to begin thanking the European Institute and International Telecommunications Satellite Organization, ITSO, for inviting me to address this special meeting of the Institute's Roundtable on Telecommunications and Information Technology on the prospects and challenges for transatlantic and global agreements on key agenda items of the upcoming ITU World Radio Communication Conference 2015 to be held in Geneva in November this year. Allow me to briefly speak about the organization I'm representing today. Actually, I'm leaving today. The Inter-American Telecommunication Commission, mostly known by its Spanish acronym, CITEL. CITEL is an entity of the Organization of American States, established by the General Assembly, with the aim of promoting the development of telecommunications and information and communication technologies in the Americas region. Recognizing the broad political, economic, and social diversity among the various countries in the hemisphere, CITEL is based on commitment, consensus building, and a goal of assisting OAS member states to meet their wide-ranging infrastructure needs through the evaluation of the legal, regulatory, and technical means available to promote market development, universal access to information communication technologies, common standards, network and service interoperability, and the compatible use of the radio spectrum. Our membership is comprised by 34 OAS member states, telecommunications and internet industry stakeholders, and representatives of the academia and civil society. The participation of other international organizations and the permanent observer countries to the OAS in our activities is also welcome. Radio communication-related matters in CITEL fall under the jurisdiction of the Permanent Consultative Committee 2, PCC 2, which serves as an advisory committee promoting the planning, coordination, harmonization, and efficient use of the radio spectrum, as well as geostationary and non-geostationary satellite orbits for radio communication services, including broadcasting. Our preparatory work for WRC-15 has been commissioned to a special working group of CITEL's Permanent Consultative Committee 2 under the able leadership of Mr. Hector Bude from Uruguay, the working group's chair, who has been assisted in this endeavor by Mr. Carmelo Rivera from the United States, the working group's vice chair. Our final meeting to prepare for WRC-15 was held from August 17th to 21st, 2015 in Ottawa, Canada, where 230 inter-American proposals for the conference were approved. Let me talk briefly about inter-American proposals. An inter-American proposal, we call it an IAP, is a proposal that has been supported by at least 6 member states, and it's not opposed by more than 50% of the number of supports obtained. This is the criteria we use to cast the support and oppositions to each proposal that is tabled for consideration of CITEL member states. We adopted IAPs on all agenda items and issues, except a few. For example, agenda item 1.1, UHF band, we were not able to develop an IAP in this 170, 698 megahertz band. Other items like 1.2, 162, and so on, small items, they are not contemplated within American proposals. Our proposals, they were grouped according to their specificity in the agenda items of the conference. So we have a group of proposals that are related to mobile and amateur issues, another group with maritime, aeronautical, and radio location issues, science issues, satellite location issues, satellite regulatory issues, general issues, and agenda item 10, that means agenda items for future conferences. So it would be extremely boring for me to delve into the 230 proposals that we approved, but I would like to name a few. I think that they are the most interesting, and I try to get your attention for that. So first, I'd like to refer to agenda item 1.1, IMT and terrestrial mobile broadband, identification of frequency bands for the deployment, such kind of advanced networks. So we were able to develop an IP identifying the L bands, 1427 to 1518 megahertz, for deployment of IMT networks, together with other regulatory provisions regarding limits for unwanted emissions. Also, in terms of identification of frequency bands for IMT, we were able to propose a mobile service allocation in the 3400, 3500 megahertz, and identification for IMT of the 3400, 3600 megahertz frequency band. That is adjacent to a lot of satellite networks. You can imagine the difficulty for reaching all these agreements involving different services, terrestrial and satellite. Together with these identifications and modifications to Article 5 of the radio regulations, we also adopted an IP proposing no change in the frequency allocation table between the frequency range between 3600 and 4200 megahertz, so the C-band. So our proposals, no change. Going on, we have also an interesting IEP related to agenda item 1.3, that means broadband public protection and disaster relief systems. And our proposal includes a text encouraging administrations to consider the 698, 869 megahertz frequency tuning ranges to achieve global harmonization. And also contains other regulatory provisions that I'm not going to delve into. Moving on, I'd like to refer now to agenda item 1.5 that relates to unmanned aircraft systems. And we approved a proposal proposing a modification in Article 5 of the radio regulations in various portions of the frequency band ranging from 10 gigahertz to 30 gigahertz. And we are also proposing to add a footnote in most FSS bands from 10 to 30 gigahertz to allow for control and non-payload communication of unmanned aircraft systems. So we had considerable discussions on that, and we succeeded in reaching consensus in developing this proposal. We have also an interesting proposal related to agenda item 1.18. There's radio location service for automotive applications in the 77.578 gigahertz frequency band. And it's proposing a primary allocation to this kind of application, the frequency band mentioned. Another very interesting proposal that we have relates to an item that was added to the agenda of the conference by the Plenipotentiary Conference in Busan in 2014, relates to global flight tracking. So we are proposing a modification in Article 5 for a primary allocation to aeronautical mobile service, satellite service en route, in the 1087.7, 10992.3 megahertz band to enable satellite reception of automatic dependent surveillance broadcast messages transmitted in the aeronautical mobile service in accordance with ICAO standards. So this is a very important item, and it got a very significant support from CTL member states. Also, in relation to Agenda 113, we adopted an IP just removing the regulatory provision of a 5-kilometer distance separation limits and remove the reference to extravehicular activities in relation to satellite research service. So we also proposing to suppress Resolution 652 of WRC-15. Now, concluding my initial remarks, I'd like to highlight some very creative proposals that we are putting forward the conference in relation to the agenda for future conferences. I would like to refer first to topic A. We are proposing the consideration of a primary allocation to the meteorological satellite service in the 460, 407 megahertz frequency band. So this is proposed with the aim to allow meteorological satellite service to operate on a co-primary status with fixed mobile service. We have also a proposal on considering the possibility of allocating the frequency band 5350 to 5470 to radio land service. So to improve the ability to deploy wireless access systems in this frequency band. There is also a very interesting proposal. We are just proposing the consideration of spectrum requirements for the Global Aeronautical Distress and Safety System, GADS, and aircraft flight tracking. So this is also contemplated in a proposal from CITEL. There's another proposal also proposing the modernization of the Global Maritime Distress and Safety Service, GMDSS. It's an important IMO initiative due to be completed in 2018, which may lead to changes of many maritime provisions of the radio regulations. This is a very important thing. Also, we are proposing the study of possible expansion of existing high-altitude platform systems, HAPS, identifications by revising existing geographical, technical, and regulatory restrictions, as well as possible additional identifications within the existing fixed service allocations. So this is basically intended for enabling the deployment of broadband networks in rural and remote regions using high-altitude platform systems. This is very important in the Americas region due to the digital gap that we still have in most of our countries. Also, we are proposing that ITU conduct studies to consider the possibility of allocating frequency band 40 to 50 megahertz to Earth exploration satellite service. The idea is to examine the possible location and compatibility of active spaceborne radar sounder operations in this frequency band for measurements of the Earth. I mean, radar maps to locate water and ice deposits. It was proposed and was just approved in Ottawa. We are also proposing consider spectrum requirements and possible allocation to the fixed satellite service in the 30 gigahertz frequency band. And also another proposal to provide recognition and protection of space weather sensors in the radio regulations. Finally, I'm glad to inform that after considerable discussions, we approved a proposal regarding the identification of frequency bands for IMT above 6 gigahertz. This is for the deployments of IMT networks to comply with the demands in 2020 and beyond. So we are proposing consideration of spectrum requirements and potential identification for the terrestrial component of IMT to facilitate mobile broadband applications in specific frequency range within the band 10 to 76 gigahertz. And finally, we have another proposal that it's proposing to eliminate the regulatory uncertainty inherent to the application of number 22.2 to non-geostationary satellites operating in the FSS frequency bands, the V bands, and the absence of coordination conditions applicable to such systems in this band. So I believe that we have a very interesting group of proposals to be considered by the conference. We have taken into consideration all studies developed by ITOR study groups and specialized committees, and the discussions held in the conference preparatory meeting held in February this year. So I thank you very much, and I could come back with more information in the Q&A session, okay? Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Clovis. Next we'll listen to Ambassador Armstrong.
I think I'll just stay here at the table if that's all right with people, and we'll save a few seconds at least in terms of moving back and forth. Thank you, Joel and Jose, for your introduction and for hosting this effort, and of course to Clovis. Let me just congratulate him on a remarkable tenure in leading CTEL. I think, as you can tell from the remarkable conference we just held in Ottawa, that would not have happened in CTEL 15 years ago, Clovis, in terms of the Americas coming together, which is the other point in terms of most of the items that he identified had widespread, unified support from the very southern parts of South America all the way to Canada. And as a result, CTEL has emerged, with due respect to our European colleagues, as a real force at the ITU, and certainly in this WRC, thanks to Clovis's leadership. And again, thank you very much for the tremendous work you've done on behalf of the United States, but also for the Inter-American region. Thank you very much. I'm delighted once again to be here at the European Institute and to talk about WRC. As I indicated, when I was here 3.5 years ago, I did not expect to come back a second time, but I'm enjoying working with many of my colleagues who were there with me in WRC-12, some of whom are here today, and we're looking forward to a very interesting and important World Radio Conference in Geneva starting the beginning of November. And of course, again, thank you to the European Institute and to ITSO for co-hosting this breakfast and for the leadership and interest that you continue to focus on this critical area of wireless communications. I think that Patrick has already given us a good overview of the ITU and WRC process. I would just say that this conference, as with other World Radio conferences, provides a great opportunity for the world to come together to really harness the wireless communications industry to foster innovation and technological change that will certainly advance economic growth, create new jobs, and increase national security. And I think you could also tell from the list of agenda items that CTEL just approved that we have an impact on areas that you wouldn't normally think of, whether it's maritime issues or the next generation of the Internet of Things that will live in your car, or disaster relief and preparedness. Everything that we are looking at is going mobile and is depending on wireless communications and the WRC to do its work. And I would also just say to my friends from ITSO in particular that that is not just terrestrial use of wireless communication, but also satellite use. I've been well schooled in that, and I want you to know that I, like the United States, place a high value on the importance of satellite technology. As an old cable guy, I know that you cannot deliver a cable network without a satellite. So I don't need any education on that, although there are many of you who remind me of that issue as we go forward. Without getting into too much detail, we can save that for the Q&A for those of you who are interested. The U.S. goes into this WRC process with about 5 very high priority items, some of which track very closely with Clovis's excellent summary of what happened in Ottawa in August. First and foremost is to continue to advance the work that we began in WRC-12 to globally identify more spectrum for mobile broadband services. I think it's very clear, and just last week in New York during the United Nations sessions on development, wireless infrastructure was identified as a critical national infrastructure. There's obviously a dramatic growth in the demand and use and number of devices that are used. Just a quick show of hands, how many people here have one smartphone? Just a quick show of hands. How many have 2? 3? How many have kids here? How many do they have? You can't even count how many. How many have at least one tablet? How many have 2 tablets? Who has a Kindle? I mean, the list goes on, right? All these things have happened in 5 or 6 years, and it's not just in developed countries like the United States, but around the world. I've found as we've done our bilateral and regional meetings, the explosion in the growth of the wireless infrastructure, the number of devices, the way in which we entertain ourselves, inform ourselves, conduct critical services, whether it's e-health, e-banking, e-government, is extraordinary. And for those of us who have been in business, there's a hockey stick effect that people dream of. The hockey stick for the demand for mobile broadband and devices and services continues to go up, and that's before, as we think about some of the new innovative proposals coming forward, that's before we connect the 3 billion people who today have no connection to the internet. So this is the #1 priority of the President, and it certainly will continue to be a #1 priority for us as we look at this telecommunications meeting coming up. Second major priority is also directly related to economic growth and opportunity, both in the United States and internationally, and that has to do with the issue of continuing to pave the way for the innovative use of unmanned aircraft systems to meet civilian needs. Now, we're well aware of the use of unmanned aircraft with respect to military applications, but here I'm talking about the clear opportunity to use these remarkable new aircraft for civilian applications. UAS will be a major new element of the aviation sector, both in the United States and across the world. We estimate in the United States alone, this will have an $80 billion impact on the economy over the next decade, and we'll be supporting new services ranging from weather forecasting to disaster relief to pipeline monitoring. We're now using unmanned aircraft to monitor the wildfires in the Northwest, to border security. And the issue before WRC-15 will be to use existing, I might add, satellite infrastructure to command and control unmanned aircraft beyond the line of sight as it's being remotely piloted. And this is a very high priority for the United States. A third priority, consistent with some of the introductory comments, of course, is to continue to look for ways to improve the management of and growth of the satellite industry. I don't think there's an administration on the planet that is more dependent on, more focused on, that understands more the value of satellites than the United States. And of course, during this conference, we're going to find some new applications of that satellite infrastructure, both, as I just mentioned, for the command and control of unmanned aircraft, but also, as Clovis mentioned, for doing a better job in terms of global flight tracking in the wake of the Air Malaysian disaster. A fourth priority for the United States will be to continue to strengthen NASA's space science activities. And of course, we only have to look at the remarkable new news from Mars in the last few days to understand how our investment in space science continues to pay remarkable dividends in terms of us understanding the universe that we live in and all of the scientific knowledge and benefits that grow from that investment. And finally, as has been mentioned earlier, we will spend a good deal of time shaping the agenda for the WRC-19 conference, where once again the #1 priority will be to find spectrum for mobile broadband, both terrestrially and delivered via satellite, This will be a high priority to continue to find ways to both meet the rising demand for spectrum, but also to close the digital divide, which again, as Clovis mentioned, is increasingly a critical issue, I think, for administrations across the globe. Now, the good news, I think, from the European Institute focus is that the U.S. and Europe really share these priorities in most part, I think. We've certainly worked closely with the EU and many member states in preparing for this conference. You know, Andrea, I would say that we wish the European Union had a little more sense of urgency of using the UHF band for delivering mobile data services, but we're very impressed at the very thorough and comprehensive digital plan that looks comprehensively at developing a policy framework for advancing the digital economy, and I look forward to hearing your comments this morning. But we, again, are working very closely with Europe, not only on the digital issues, but we also share an interest in the next generation of mobile broadband services, so-called 5G, as well as the unmanned aircraft system opportunity. As Clovis suggested, certainly the Americas region, and I think the U.S., is well positioned for a very successful WRC-15. Our greatest strength, however, as always, is the experience and expertise of the U.S. delegation, several of whom are here today. This really is truly a public-private partnership in the United States. And I think it's one of the things that's not unique to, but distinguishes the U.S. approach to World Radio conferences. About 60% of our delegation of 170 people that we'll have in Geneva are public sector experts. About 40% come from the private sector, including real pros like Leslie. And a number of our delegates have participated in, I think, Tricia, our most recent delegation meeting had a show of hands. We had one delegate who shall go unnamed, but who is a member of this club, I might point out, who has been, I believe, at 15 World Radio conferences. There are others who seven or eight World Radio conferences. So the experience matters. I would say that obviously there will be challenges, Patrick, that we will face at WRC-15. I suspect you'll tease a few of those out. But I'm confident that once again, under the auspices and leadership of the ITU, that we're going to have a very successful conference and continuing to harness wireless communications to improve the lives of people all across this globe. So again, thank you for hosting this discussion, and I look forward to our Q&A session later. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We move on now to Andrea.
Thank you, Patrick, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to the European Institute and to ITSO for organizing this event and for inviting me to present the views of the European Union. As it has already been said, but I think it's worth repeating, a big thanks to the Internet Society as well for providing the webcast for this event. Those who have been working with me since I arrived, I took service here as a counselor of the delegation, know that I am a rather undiplomatic diplomat, which also means that I am very honest in my engagements with all of you. So I will be honest, and I will have you know that I am not the foremost expert on these matters. As a counselor, I am a jack of all trades and a master of none. It's our line of job. So I have made sure to talk to my colleagues in Brussels and try to understand what we are doing. I have colleagues who probably know by heart every allocation of every band of electromagnetic spectrum since the early 90s until today. I am not one of those. So in the Q&A, if there will be specific questions, very specific questions, I say straight ahead, I might not be able to answer your question, but I will certainly take note. I will talk to Brussels and I will get back to you. Now, having said that, it's kind of my personal insurance policy. Let me present to you the high-level brief overview with some level of detail as well. You will hopefully not be disappointed about the European Union approach to WRC-15. I apologize in advance if what I'm going to say is procedural, but I think it is important to keep in mind, for those of you who are not aware, how the European approach to the WRC and in general to ITU negotiations and conferences works. As many of you will know, the European positions at the ITU conferences are prepared to the CPT, the Conference of European Postal Operators and Telecommunication Operators, which includes all the EU member states, but also a rather broad number of other states which are not member states of the EU. And this makes, of course, internal negotiations to come to common positions sometimes more challenging. On the other hand, the European Union legal framework includes in the 2002 Framework Directive, which has later been updated in 2009, if you're interested, a clear indication, a clear obligation for European Union member states to ensure the effective management of frequencies in accordance with a certain number of principles, which include, first of all, the promotion of competition within the European Union single market, but also the promotion of a number of other interests, including economic public interest, freedom of expression, the avoidance of harmful interferences, and cultural and technical aspects of EU policies. Why I'm saying this because, as our moderator has mentioned cybersecurity and cybercrime. Now, to be absolutely honest, in the run-up to WRC-15, I am personally not aware of specific proposals from the CPT or from European Union member states or from the European Union itself that specifically refer to these issues. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that whatever we do in the field of spectrum management, whatever the European Union does, the European Union member states do in the field of spectrum management, has to take into account a number of other policy priorities, which do include, under the European Union framework, also cybersecurity and the fight against cybercrime. In procedural terms, in addition to the meetings of the CPT, as again some of you might be aware, organized two workshops, one on the 10th of December of 2014, and the other on the 14th of April of 2015. These workshops were co-organized by the CPT and the European Commission. Public consultations were also ran in order to gather from as many stakeholders as possible within the CPT region, which again includes the European Union, but also other regions, including Russia, to be clear, and all a part of the Central Asian republics. Following this public consultation, in parallel, another group, just to complicate matters in the European Union, we like to complicate our life from both a procedural and substantive point of view. There is another group which is called, again, some of you might be aware, the Radio Spectrum Policy Group. This group, it is a European Union group. It is composed of the 28 representatives of the 28 member states of the European Commission and members of the European Economic Area, candidate countries, as well as observers from ITSO, which is the European Telecommunications Standardization Institute, and CPT participate. The RSPG, the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, provided a number of recommendations for EU member states. Now, out of this rather admittedly cumbersome process, I must admit I'm not an expert of the other regions' processes. I suspect, life being what it is, that their process is maybe at least as complicated as ours in order to come to common positions. As part, throughout that, thanks to that process, the European Commission has identified a few items, agenda items on WRC-15, which have a clear impact on EU policies, and as such should be addressed. That is the position of the European Commission, should be addressed, and of member states as well, I would say, should be addressed in coherence with what the European Union legal framework says. And these three agenda items are agenda item 1.1, 1.2, so 1.1 on the allocation of electromagnetic frequencies for IMT, or mobile services, 1.2 on the coexistence. The main issue there is the coexistence between, again, mobile broadband and broadcasting services. And interestingly enough, 1.18 on automotive safety, or intercar radar systems for automotive safety. I do have all the papers here with me, so if you're interested in the precise content of those proposals, I'm happy to share them with you. But at this stage, I just wanted to identify that as far as European Union policies and legislations are concerned, these are the 3 points in which there is a clear identification of overlaps between EU policy and the agenda item on WRC, and on which, therefore, we have requested member states, which are the members of the ITU. The European Commission is a sector member of the ITU. It does not have a vote, so we have requested the member states to follow the guidelines which correspond to European Union policy. In addition to that, through the input of the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, which also ran consultations, and through the cooperation with the CPT, what people who have been following this will notice is that very often the Radio Spectrum Policy Group can come to rather more assertive positions than the CPT, which is quite understandable given that the membership of the Radio Spectrum Policy Group is narrower than the CPT. So it's pretty easier from many points of view to identify common position. The Radio Spectrum Policy Group has identified a number of other agenda items on the WRC-15 agenda, which include many of the agenda items that my esteemed colleagues have mentioned before, including the use of drones for civilian purposes, the use of geostationary low Earth satellites, and so on and so forth. Again, if people are interested, I have the full list. And by the way, the RSPG opinion is public, and I'm happy to provide a link to that opinion if anybody is interested. For those other agenda points, the RSPG drafted a set of recommendations to member states, to EU member states. The European Commission supports those recommendations. On the substance, we agree with all those recommendations, but in terms of EU law, we are not in a position, we are neither obliged nor do we have the prerogative to tell, yes, you have to follow those recommendations. But I think my sense and what my colleagues in Brussels tell me is that there is a broad consensus on all the recommendations of the RSPG opinion, which again is public. I'm not going to read all the opinion to you. It's an agile 30 pages, which I had the pleasure to read yesterday night and the day before yesterday night. So I will not read it. Thank you, Joel. That's how I want to spend my evenings in the sea. I will not read to you, but again, it is public. And last but not least, one point looking is WRC-15 is a future-oriented conference. The European Union completely agrees with the remarks, in particular the remarks of Ambassador Armstrong on the importance of finding common global way to allocate the electromagnetic spectrum to promote broadband deployment. That is a clear policy of the European Union, within the European Union, with our candidate countries, with our neighboring countries, etc. So WRC-15 is a forward-looking conference, but if we want to look even more at the future, a key strategic policy priority of the European Commission is 5G technologies, 5G mobile technologies. Now, the allocation of electromagnetic spectrum is part of the overall reflection of the overall work that the European Commission and the European Union, in fact, is conducting on 5G. On this note, let me just mention that Commissioner Oettinger, who was just recently, last week, in town here in Washington, D.C., has been engaged in extensive conversation with many of our U.S. counterparts, including the Federal Communications Commission, the Department of Commerce, and others, pursuing, and this is public information, it's not a secret, pursuing a memorandum of understanding between the European Union and the U.S. In order to cooperatively work on 5G technologies in order to avoid fragmentation in the market. And again, that level of cooperation includes allocation of electromagnetic spectrum in the bands above 6 gigahertz, as my esteemed colleagues have mentioned, so I will not go into too much detail there, but also on all other kinds of technological development and standardization. The European Commission has very recently, Commissioner Oettinger, immediately after the trip to the US, was in China for the high-level economic dialogue, and the European Commission and China has signed, in fact, a memorandum of understanding for cooperation of 5G technologies, which is in addition to the existing memorandum of understanding which the European Commission has signed with South Korea and the Philippines. So you can see a clear pattern here when it comes to 5G. On top of all of that, the European Commission, with the cooperation of industry and our member states, has created a 5G public-private partnership. I'm insisting very much on this point because certainly in terms of the WRC-15, one of our key asks, I would say, in terms of the future of WRC is to launch a study and to request through the WRC procedures to launch studies for WRC-19 in order to get at that point with a very clear idea of how we can have a global allocation of electromagnetic bands above 6 gigahertz to support 5G, the deployment of 5G technologies. And this will be complementary, as I said, to other forms, to other work that we are conducting on 5G. And we certainly hope that this work, we will be able to conduct this work very soon in formal cooperation with the United States government, which I think is fair to say has some questions, on what we would like to work on. But having been since this is a request on 5G cooperation that has been ongoing for some time, the conversation with the US, I had the previous Vice President of the Commission, Nelly Kroes, Vice President who came here last September, Vice President Ansip in May, Commissioner Oettinger here, and the conversation of 5G have been one of the elements, including for what concerns electromagnetic spectrum allocation, have been one of the elements in each of this conversation. I cannot speak for the US government, obviously, but my sense is that there is a sense that we are moving forward in identifying ways in which we can practically cooperate. And we certainly hope that WRC-15 will be one of those occasions for the specific topic of spectrum allocation. I think I would stop here. I will, Ambassador Decker, I will certainly report back to Brussels your concerns concerning our approach to UHF bans. I will make sure that they're aware of that. I'm pretty sure they are already aware.
They have heard them when I was in Brussels.
I am sure, Ambassador, I've been enjoying working in the U.S. for 14 months now, so I am absolutely sure that they have heard your concerns on those matters. I think I will stop here. As I said, I would like to leave some time for my fellow panelists, but also for the Q&A. I do have plenty of more specific information. If anybody's interested, I will be happy to react during the Q&A. Or, as I said, if there is information that I do not have at the moment, I will be very happy to relay that information to Brussels and make sure that you get an answer as soon as possible. So thank you very much again to the organizers, and I'm looking forward to the presentation of Leslie.
Thank you, Andrea. Leslie.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And if it's okay, I'll remain at the table as well. Stay close to my coffee for my presentation. As the last speaker, I don't really want to take up too much time. Many of the points that I would have raised have already been raised. But let me begin, if I may, just expressing a few thanks. Thanks, first of all, to the European Institute and to ITSO for the invitation to Verizon. It's always a pleasure to be back and to talk about this issue and see so many good friends and colleagues in the room. My second thank you goes to Patrick, our moderator, who reminded me how long I've been in this industry. Indeed, it's been a few years. I think the first WRC I attended was in the late 80s, as an employee of ComSat and then Intelsat. And about 3 rounds of those meetings, I decided to take about 10 years off to recuperate, and now I'm back for the second round, and a few years left of me, and then we'll see what happens. And finally, thanks go to Ambassador Decker-Anstrom for identifying all the happy Verizon customers out there this morning with all your devices. So thank you very much for that. It's always good to see that. Thank you. I must say, as a member of the U.S. delegation, before I say anything else, I must say that it's been a privilege to work with so many colleagues that have been in this business for so long, as the ambassador mentioned earlier. It will make a tremendous difference in a very difficult meeting. These sessions are becoming more and more difficult as we deal with challenging issues for spectrum and for ever-increasing new services. But at the top of the list, I think really thanks must go for Ambassador Anstrom for agreeing to come back for a second time to head the delegation. It will make a tremendous difference. Julie Zoller, his team, State Department, NTIA, and FCC, I think we have the strongest delegation, the strongest set of spokespersons that I have ever encountered. So that's good. I think it's important. I think it will come in very, very handy in the month of November. So my thanks go out to all of them, and I'm looking forward to working with them. The second point on the preparations, which have been long and will be coming to an end at some point in the month of October. Clovis talked a little bit about CTEL, and again, as a company that has participated in CTEL for many, many years, really must underline the importance of coming up with intra-American proposals, these common views on key issues. This day and age, when you go to a global conference, you have to have as many common views as you can just to get on the agenda. So I think the role of CTEL, Clovis's leadership over the years, both PCCs, has really, really been critical. And I think this time, if I'm not wrong, Clovis, we have a record number of IAPs coming into the WRC. I hope I'm right in saying that. So very much looking forward to that, and my my thanks go to CTEL and the leadership of CTEL. Having said that, a number of speakers have talked about key agenda items, and I agree with all of them. Andrea talked about some from the European perspective, Ambassador Answer from the U.S. The points that were made are, I would agree with all of them. They're all critical. Let me just raise two items from Verizon's perspective, and perhaps I think maybe the terrestrial industry, mobile industry, would share my views along these lines. Of course, agenda item 1.1 really is a critical item at this meeting. We've known for a long time that it will be important, and indeed we have seen what a critical role this has been to digital economies and societies around the world. As I travel and I meet with various governments, the role and the importance of having high-speed wireless digital availabilities for services is a major consideration for governments at the highest levels. People are looking at it. They're trying to assure that as much spectrum is available as possible and as quickly as possible. And indeed, just this morning, I saw that the government of Poland has just moved up an auction on 800 megahertz and 2.4 gigahertz. They're not alone. Many administrations are moving ahead with this as well. So there is no issue about the importance of this, and I think agenda item 1.1 will be a key item for the conference. I anticipate we'll spend a number of long hours discussing it, and I anticipate and I hope that we'll be able to come back to you and report out on the success that we have within the WRC on this issue. The second item would be the future WRC agenda items, and here, from the mobile terrestrial industry, it really is critical because of the long lead times that we have in identifying spectrum for our services. I think that when we start talking about an agenda for WRC-19, people's eyes will start glazing over, saying, my God, it's only 2015, but the years go by very fast, and I think that it really is very, very important from our perspective to get this agenda item up and at the WRC 2015 discussions, and I think we will. The question is, what will it be, and what kind of words do we put around certain specific bands going forward for this? So I think that the issues of 6 gigahertz and above, as Andrea was saying, will be a critical issue. I think the discussions have been well underway for some time, and I think it will be successful in coming up with a set of acceptable framework for further discussions between 2015 and 2019. The compatibility studies that will be done for 2019 WRC will be critical. I'm looking forward to the discussions with colleagues and friends from the broadcasting and satellite industries. I think that the time frame that we have available will have to be used very diligently. There are a number of important issues that need to be attended to, a number of important technologies that we need to look at. And finally, to close off, maybe just on a personal note, the long lead times involved in dealing with spectrum matters really is critical. We understand that the discussions have to begin at this WRC for WRC 2019. My personal view has always been to have ongoing discussions with all industry representatives for the simple reason that the technology that is evolving is doing so at such a rapid rate that we need to be diligent and we need to take a careful look at what these technologies are and what impact they would have on all compatibility and sharing studies going forward. So this requires a lot of discussion, and I intend to continue to do the discussions in a very long process that will take us from 2016 to 2019. It's really all quite connected in one long process going forward. So the next 3 years will be very interesting. I'm looking forward to a very productive WRC-15. I'm looking forward to being part of the U.S. delegation. Looking forward to talking with you again after the end of the conference and reporting our successes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And with that, the floor is open. It would be helpful if you perhaps mention the organization you work for so as to give the opportunity to the speaker to understand what type of viewpoint you are likely to be expecting.
Okay, well, my name's Tricia Paoletta. I'm at Harris Wilcher and Grannis, and I am on the U.S. delegation for the cable industry and for Google. So I certainly agree with Leslie that our ambassador has done a great job, and of course, I agree with our ambassador that Clovis and CETEL have done wonderful jobs, so that's all wonderful. I also represent 4G Americas, and so familiar with the work of CETEL and that prism. But 4G Americas, for Andrea's and perhaps Patrick's background, is the leading association, trade association in the Americas for working on 5G. So very interested in your comments about the MOU. On the spectrum below 1 gigahertz low band, obviously 5G is both going to be improving the broadband speeds and capacity for the tablets and smartphones we all love and use every day, in addition to the Internet of Things and machine to machine. So you do need both high band and low band spectrum. So the work above 6 gigahertz is fundamental. But we will also, or the mobile broadband industry will need more spectrum, in the low bands below 1 gigahertz. So certainly I would commend, the European Union to go back and look hard at the 1.2 issues and, broadcast spectrum. That will be critical, I think, for 5G to really develop to its fullest potential, in Europe and around the world. So with all that in mind, were there bands that were identified in the MOU, or what bands, is the European Union looking at for low-band 5G spectrum?
Thank you, and I certainly taken note of your remark concerning low band, and I'll make sure that my colleagues in Brussels are well aware of that, although I suspect, again, that they are aware of that. I should also thank 4G America, because as a matter of fact, I was invited already back in October, I think, at a wonderful conference in California on 5G, on the future of 5G deployment, etc. Lots of very smart technical people. I can't claim I understood everything that was being said in the room, but it was nonetheless an interesting experience, so thank you for that. Just to be clear, because I'm afraid that I might have been a bit unclear, the memorandum of understanding that we have signed with South Korea, Singapore, I think it's Singapore, and China most recently, and we hope we will soon sign with the United States of America, concern a range of cooperation areas. Specifically on the allocation of electromagnetic spectrum, to my knowledge, those memorandum of understanding per se do not already identify common position on the allocation of spectrum, because that is left to the appropriate procedures, including by the preparation to the WRC. What does memorandum of understanding include are commitments to cooperate on, to the extent possible and feasible, on standardization across all the layers of the very vast 5G ecosystem, on research and innovation, so joint calls for research and innovation, and the commitment to work together. I think that is certainly the case for South Korea, if I remember correctly, on the allocation of electromagnetic spectrum. But again, to be clear, to my knowledge, those memorandum of understanding do not commit either of the parties on a common position at the WRC for what concerns the allocation, either below 1 gigahertz or above 6 gigahertz. I hope that clarifies the position, and I apologize if that was unclear during my remarks.
Thank you. Any other question, comment?
My name is Linda Moore. I'm with Congressional Research Service, and I want to follow up on the 5G question. Does the European Union's agreements with these different countries, with China, et cetera, include multilateral across the board, so that if you sign an MOU with Europe, have you also included China for the United States? And then the other question related to that is, in dealing with the Department of Commerce, the NTIA, I assume, and the FCC, are you also dealing with the State Department as part of this 5G MOU negotiation? Okay? Is that clear?
Yeah, I hope so, yes. And So I choose my words carefully because we have a Congressional Research Service in Europe as well, working for the European Parliament. I'm always very careful when I answer questions of those fine colleagues. So to my knowledge and understanding, when it comes to the memorandum of understanding that we have signed, those are bilateral memorandum of understanding. So we have one with South Korea, we have signed one with China, but those memoranda are independent from one another. Now, clearly from our perspective, we do have a number of key issues which we put in all the MOUs. That doesn't necessarily mean that our counterparts agree that those are the key issues for them. That is certainly not the case. Again, we do not have at this stage a memorandum of understanding or any other kind of formal cooperation agreement with the US on this matter, even though, and perhaps I was not clear enough during my presentation, that doesn't mean at all that as far as we can see, the US is not interested in working with us on 5G. I want to be very clear on that. The questions that are coming from the US, and to answer the second part of your question, we have talked to a lot of different counterparts in the US. I think, and I say this with all possible due respect, please do not misunderstand me, but I think it is connaturate to the US system on these specific matters. It is a very distributed system. It's a very bottom-up system. So it is sometimes difficult for us, at least, to identify any particular agency in the US at the federal level, or even more so at the state level, we deal with the federal level, obviously, that specifically deals with 5G. Again, that is unsurprising, because when we're talking about WRC, things are easy, quote unquote. It's about electromagnetic spectrum, and we know who is dealing with that in Europe. We know, well, as I said, our situation is a bit complex, but give or take, we know who is dealing with that in Europe, we know who is dealing with that in the US, we know who is dealing with that specific aspect of the discussion. But the discussion of 5G are much broader, as I said. They include a number of elements related to standardization, research and innovation, services. So what I can say is that we have spoken to the Department of Commerce, including but not limited to the NTIA, with the State Department, with the White House, with a number of other counterparts. We have also spoken with industry, etc. I hope I'm not giving the wrong impression, in the sense that we find it absolutely normal that when we discuss between Europe and the US, these are two very large, well, one country and a set of large countries, developed economies with economic interests and sometimes strong opinions on where to go in which direction to go in any particular field. So the fact that we have signed agreements with other countries doesn't mean at all that we are not willing to pursue these discussions with the US. I want that to be very, very clear. But again, I also would like to, I mentioned 5G because it is, as Leslie and others have mentioned, it is a clear point for the future WRC, so it's important to keep in mind that this is a priority for us. But on the other hand, we are certainly not going to the WRC and starting to talk, when it comes to 5G, start wanting to discuss about things that go beyond the specific issue of electromagnetic spectrum, which is the scope of work of the WRC. Given previous experience, I think we all want ITU conferences to focus specifically on the mandate that they have for any particular conference and not go beyond that.
You know, if I could, I would just add, and I'm not going to address specifically the memorandum of understanding process, but I think as you listen to some of the other panelists today, in effect, WRC-15 and the work that will go on to design the WRC-19 study process and ultimately shape the debate at WRC-19 will serve as a de facto environment to address some of the questions you're talking about. The U.S. and CTEL have a very specific inter-American proposal that identifies, I believe, 8 specific bands that should be studied by the ITU study process during the next 4 years. It calls for characteristics for each of those 5G systems that would be designed to use those bands, to be developed. We can't mandate this, as Clovis and others know, but to have those characteristics identified, we hope by 2016, that would allow the studies to really move forward in great detail. And the results of those studies would then go to the final preparation process and the final deliberations of WRC 2019. And I would expect, Andrea, that as part of that, the European Commission would play a very central role in identifying the bands that Europe was interested in, that in turn would shape the European discussion at WRC-15 about which bands to be studied, as will other administrations like China, Korea, Singapore, et cetera. So in some ways, the WRC process, and I think it underscores how important the WRC process is, will create an orderly way in which the experts can look at specific bands and the characteristics of the 5G systems that would be deployed in those bands and come up with recommendations for WRC-19 that would then allow the world to move forward. Understanding that 5G is still a concept and not a specific set of characteristics, right? So I hope that helps some in terms of how this would come together. And of course, in the U.S., our process is a very bottoms-up one in that the two expert agencies that lead the U.S. process, both from the public and private sector sides, are the NTIA and the FCC, representing the public and private sectors. The State Department role I like to describe in the WRC process is really is sort of a referee. You know, we wear striped shirts with whistles, and if the NTIA and the FCC can't reach an agreement or seem to be reaching some consensus that seems a little out of bounds with what might make some sense, we'll blow our whistle and reconvene the participants to come to a conclusion. But the expert agencies that lead all of this work are the NTIA and the FCC, along with their private sector constituents. I hope that's helpful.
Mr. Ambassador, are you saying that either in the US or Europe agencies do not agree on everything? I'm surprised.
I actually expect, I think because of the work that the EU and the EC have done in terms of the One Digital Economy work, that we will find agreement with the European community at WRC-15 on the bands that will be studied for the next 4 years. I mean, at the moment, I don't believe Europe came to conclusions during their preparatory meetings going into Geneva, but this conference can't come to a conclusion about how to move forward on 5G without Asia and the United States, along with other CTEL countries, and Europe coming to an agreement about what bands we're going to study. So that will, again, as Leslie's pointed out, I think be one of the really big outcomes will be an agreement that will be reached about the bands to be studied.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Perhaps I can ask one of mine, my own, addressed to Ambassador, specifically with regard to agenda item 1.1. What would you envisage as being the key points that need to be looked at in trying to find convergence, whether it is at the global level or at the regional level? Because I think when you look at the proposals that are going to the conference, there are some, let's say, for example, on the C band and on the L band, there are specific bands that you can see convergence already appearing. But I think going into the conference, if someone up front started to identify what is sort of their minimum expectation in terms of items to consider, it will help move forward the negotiation agenda.
Right. Well, the world's gone through a process of looking at about 20 separate bands under agenda item 1.1 that could be identified for mobile broadband or IMT. And the process, I think, of all the regions across the world that have come to conclusions now, and every region has come to conclusions on these, really have pinpointed 3 of those 20, roughly 20 bands. One is, Clovis mentioned, is the L band, in which I think there's broad global consensus about allocating the L band for mobile broadband with some protections for adjacent services, particularly our space services, which again I think, for example, has been an area of agreement between Europe and the United States. The United States does not intend to implement IMT in the L band because of other vital services that we offer in that band, but we have supported this in the interest of globally harmonizing that band. That, of course, leads to efficiencies of scale that allow that band to be used efficiently for mobile broadband. The C-band issue, many in this room are clearly knowledgeable, as are you, about the debate that's gone on about that. The U.S. has had a very specific proposal, which is that the 3.4 to 3.7 spectrum should be identified for IMT. There have been proposals across the map on that. CTEL adopted a 3.4 to 3.6 allocation. Other administrations are looking at 3.4 to 3.8 in Europe and in Asia. Japan, for example, is looking at 3.4 to, Mike, I think it's 4.2, correct, in terms of their usage. You know, I think what we'll see is a continued evolution of very country-specific footnotes and regional allocations for some of these. We expect that the U.S. will certainly move ahead. The FCC has a proceeding to use part of the 3.4 to 3.7 band. Canada will do the same, and I think you'll continue to see sort of a diverse set of choices in the C-band area. And I think the conference will help add some harmonization to that, but I would not expect a clear global harmonization that would apply to all three regions on the C-band. And of course, there's a great deal of appreciation for the vital role that C-band plays. I mean, in the United States, as I think we all know, certainly once we get above 3.7, the U.S. has vital interest, as Jose laid out very well, I think, in terms of the everything from disaster relief to our whole broadcast television system that depends on satellites and that, major assets, billions of dollars of investment, and we have an absolute commitment that the United States would not implement IMT above 3.7 here in the United States. But we would like to be able, and the FCC is moving ahead with a proceeding that, Mike, you'll conclude that when, probably sometime early next year, from 3.55 to 3.7, I think, in the U.S. And Canada, I think, has similar plans, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. The big area of contention, as you suggested, and I'll try to be brief here, Patrick, but is in the UHF band, which for, you know, the cognoscente here is 470 to 698. But as you report back to Brussels, that's the spectrum that traditionally is used by terrestrial broadcasting. The U.S. has taken a position that should be identified for mobile broadband services, but that each administration should flexibly be able to use that, understanding that our first priority is to protect the role of local broadcasting, which provides vital services for, you know, everyone in this country and around the world. Our point is, rather than just freezing in place the allocation of that spectrum only for broadcasting, particularly as broadcasting becomes more efficient as it's moved to digital transmissions rather than analog transmissions, that for administrations that want to use some of that spectrum for mobile broadband rather than using it all for broadcasting, they should have the flexibility to do that. Quite frankly, we have not met a groundswell of support for that proposal around the world. And to the contrary, most regions and administrations have proposed a no change in order to, quote, protect their broadcast industries. Our point is that the U.S. approach that's also been endorsed by Mexico, Canada, and Colombia in this region is that any administration can choose to do whatever they want to with that spectrum, but they should have the flexibility to use it if and when they're ready to use it for mobile broadband in light of the spectrum demand that they'll have, similar to Tricia's point. My prediction would be, I don't make many predictions, but my prediction would be is that there will be a number of countries around the world that will want the flexibility to use that spectrum for mobile broadband, and that we will find a way to identify that spectrum at WRC-15, but it will not be, it's unlikely to be a global allocation at this point. But inevitably, more and more of that spectrum will be used. My point about Europe is simply that they've made the same agreement, but not to implement it until 2030. And gosh, that's a long time in terms of technology and product cycles. And I understand the European plan, and we've agreed to disagree as friends on that issue. But we think that as technology moves forward, we can both protect local broadcasters as well as use some of that spectrum for mobile broadband. So a long answer, but those are the three specific bands we're looking at under 1.1. And I think there'll be some opportunity to advance, but this will be a process that will continue, I suspect, for the next decade.
If I may very briefly react to the very thorough expose of the ambassador, which is indeed correct in terms of the positions that exist, and we, as it often happens between, well, not often actually, I think Europe and US tend to agree on most issues under the table, but sometimes we have to agree to disagree. But I think it is important to note two things. First, and probably people in this room are more aware than I am, but I think it's important to underline that radio regulations, the ITU radio regulations, which are the subject of the discussion, do not and cannot prescribe how states within the territory actually allocate the frequencies. Their purpose is to avoid cross-border interference and to optimize the use of, or to choose which primary service will be using those frequencies. And secondly, it is the position of the European Commission within the US system is that because that particular topic that the ambassador raised, that particular frequencies are certainly, I think it's fair to say, are the subject of very vibrant and vigorous discussions within Europe. From our perspective, we should make sure that as much flexibility as possible is left to our Council, the Member States, and the Parliament to decide in a democratic way how those bands should be allocated. Because, as the Ambassador mentioned, there are, at least as far as Europe is concerned, there is it's not so much about protecting broadcasting industries, it's recognizing from our perspective the economic and social and cultural value that broadcasting industries have, certainly Europe, I imagine in all other countries. We take the position of the US government on that matter. We have heard it, we report it back to Brussels. But again, point being is that what we want to achieve is to ensure that we have the flexibility, we can leave the flexibility to our internal democratic process to decide perhaps a little more quickly than 2030, on that I personally agree with the Ambassador, what should be done with those bands. And I think these 2 points, I do not disagree at all with the reconstruction, with the depiction that the Ambassador gives of the situation, but I do believe that these 2 points should be mentioned to give the full context of the situation.
Maybe just briefly, if I may, Patrick, without belaboring this, because it is an important issue that goes to the broader question of how we think about managing and managing and regulating the entire global spectrum process. This notion that Andrea has noted, that I've noted and others have, about providing flexibility to different administrations, as long as we recognize the cross-border interference issues in that, which are real and important, which is another important role that the ITU plays in this, is that technology moves very quickly, and also that every country, however, is in a very different position. So in the United States, for example, only 7% of U.S. households get their broadcast television now over the air. If you want to watch the local CBS affiliate in Washington, the likelihood is, well, at least 93% in an urban market like Washington, I would guess it's even higher, receive their local television over their cable system or a satellite system, or increasingly over their smartphone or tablet. 8% of all TV users now access broadcast television over a mobile device. Right? In the United Arab Emirates, 99% of the population gets their television from cable, satellite, or over internet devices. On the other hand, a country like Brazil, about 50% of their population still gets television over the air. So every administration's in a different position, and I think the world needs to recognize that that's the case, and it's certainly the case in Europe, that different administrations are in different places. But what we would hate to do is by failing to act at this WRC, to begin to start a process, is that when country X decides, gee, we'd now like to use some of that spectrum, they have to wait 4 years, come to a WRC, and get approval to use it. I think we're going to fail to meet and fill the spectrum gap that we need in order to facilitate this remarkable new technology of mobile broadband if we don't do that.
Further question? Yes, Joseph, please.
Thank you. One question for Ambassador Anselm. Perhaps I missed the studio. Did you mention that in relation to the CPAN, you believe that the solution will be different for the 3 regions, and that it would not be possible to have an harmonized solution for all regions? Perhaps I missed the studio, just to clarify.
So to be clear, what I indicate is I don't think we'll have a global harmonization of C-band in the 3.4 to 3.7 area across all 3 regions. Okay. In part because I think Asia in particular, and there are others who may want to add something here from the floor, Scott, Mike, others, but that certainly are going above 3.7 in terms of their use of C-band for IMT. That is not CTEL's position. There was not one CTEL administration, not one, that supported using C-band spectrum above 3.7. And most preferred to stop at 3.6. So I think, Region 2, CTEL will have one approach, Asia will have an approach, Europe will have an approach. Africa really doesn't want to allocate any C-band for the purposes of IMT, is my understanding. So I think that's why we'll continue to have somewhat of a patchwork. But at this point, I think more than half the countries in the world have signed a footnote that allows them to use C-band spectrum to deliver IMT, and at some point that number will probably increase over 100 or 115, and at some point we'll actually have a globally harmonized band for IMT in the C-band space. But the U.S. position is at least is that should never cross 3.7.
Thank you. Patrick, if you allow me, you asked Ambassador Anderson about the 1.1. Can I refer the same question to Leslie?
Oh, sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you. Please,
The question was, Patrick asked Ambassador about 1.1 and what he believes is going to happen. You mentioned that you look forward to come and comment on the success and comment on the results of WRC in 1 month's time and on the successes. So what is a success for you, for Verizon, for the mobile industry, in relation to the 1.1 question and the C-band question?
Yes, thank you very much, Jose, for the question. From our perspective, we're keeping very much an open mind with respect to the bands that we're covering and we feel can be very important. From our perspective, I think the flexibility that Ambassador Anderson was talking about really is key. From our perspective, there is a very real need for additional spectrum. So from our perspective, the rapid growth from our consumers that we're seeing, there are a number of bands that will be very important. As we look forward, and not just the C-band, but as we deploy small cells, for example, in urban areas, as we look at the tremendous growth in the speeds that will be necessary in 5G across the country and around the world, can only be completely filled by keeping a number of bands on the table, so to speak, and keeping them very much in the mix of discussions. Our technical folks are always looking at ways that we can improve the download speeds and improve the quality of the connectivity. We've been seeing in various countries around the world, including in the Americas region, concerns about the drop calls, about the quality of the connections. We see it in parts of Asia as well. So from our perspective, while C-band will be important, I think that I agree with Ambassador's assessment as to where we may come out on this. But beyond that, I think there are a number of other bands, a number of other areas where we really have to keep it within the discussions because, again, this process from 2015 through to 2019, the WRC is so closely linked with the studies that are going to be done, with the number of bands that will eventually agree to be looked at, I think will be absolutely critical. Thank you.
Maybe one more question again to, oh, sorry.
Sure. Gonzalo de Dios Intel side, I'm not going to speak about C-band. You know my opinion. 1.5, Ambassador, you raised a very good point that is a critical application that definitely technology is mature enough to be able to reflect the needs of the services that are growing. Yet the discussion is more than fragmented on 1.5. It was encouraging during the last interregional meeting to hear that the International Civil Aviation Organization was trying to find ways to ensure that the WRC process did what it needed to do to ensure that 1.5 moved forward. Right. And they were putting effort to articulate the role that the international civil aviation community would play in, if you wish, marrying the two processes to ensure that the technology could develop and flourish. Mm-hmm. The issue at WRC-15 will be controversial. However, how do you see the process going along, particularly if time runs out and you have, if anything, to defer the issue for later consideration?
Right.
It would be a shame if that is the case, but you can never, I guess, negate the fact that that could be a potential outcome of the discussions.
Right. It's a good question, and as members of our delegation know, I am an optimist. You've heard me say the same thing. I'm very optimistic about agenda item 1.5, which again, for those of you not in the trivia of WRC, is the unmanned aircraft issue that, again, would rely on a fixed satellite system infrastructure to provide the command and control of unmanned aircraft that are remotely piloted. So that's the issue, and we want to do that in a way that doesn't interfere with existing services and that also ensures the safety of life if you're in an airliner and traveling next to a very large unmanned aircraft that's has FedEx on the side of it, which we will see in the next 5 to 10 years, by the way. You want to make sure that those are controlled in a way that you fly safely, and we all have that objective clearly. So that's what this issue is all about. I'm very encouraged about where we are for several reasons. One is, again, I think one of the signature accomplishments of the CTEL regional meeting, as Chloe has appropriately identified, was no one in the Inter-American region opposed this agenda item. And while some countries held back because it's a very complicated issue and because the civil aviation authorities, as you indicated, hadn't completely reached their own conclusions about could they ensure the safety of life issues that they're responsible for in light of how we're planning to command and control these aircraft, they held back. No one opposed this coming out of the Americas. So we have a very strong, unified CTEL position, which is very important. And again, that particularly is led by Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and Colombia again, which I think is very important. Secondly, subsequent to the CTEL proposal, ICAO has indicated that that proposal, the CTEL proposal, meets all of their criteria. ICAO, again, being the International Civil Aviation Organization. So their view is that they can now set the standards and requirements necessary to preserve safety of life in light of the kind of infrastructure that we've identified for the command and control of these aircraft. Based on that, there has been significant movement in Africa, and two of the major regions in Africa, and there's one more yet to be heard from, which will make a decision the first week of the WRC. I'm very hopeful they'll endorse 1.5 along with the other two regions. So we would have Africa and the Americas combined. That's a very potent combination, as those of you know from the satellite community, in terms of operating inside a WRC. If any continent has an issue about ensuring the ability of unmanned aircraft to begin to operate more fully when it comes to delivering food, medical supplies, cargo, I mean, the issues, border monitoring in certain parts of Central Africa, I mean, the list goes on in terms of how unmanned aircraft can make a huge difference in terms of the life of Africa. In Europe, very encouragingly, again, as Andrea pointed out, this area has been pointed out as a significant economic growth opportunity for European industry, as it has been for the United States. 19 of the countries at the European meeting voted for a proposal to move ahead with unmanned aircraft. 8 opposed, so they did not have a common proposal, but I'm quite confident that the critical mass to come together with European leadership, African leadership, and Inter-American leadership. And in Asia, we have a number of countries, I think, including Japan, Australia, and others that will support this. So as you suggest, this won't happen in the first week of the conference because the details do matter. But what's before this conference on this issue is sort of unique in the sense that there are only 2 choices at this conference. Either the fixed satellite infrastructure is identified as a way of command and control of these aircraft, or nothing happens. Nothing happens. There is no option. So at that point, these aircraft aren't going to stop flying. So we're going to have a Wild West set of ad hoc decisions made by national safety authorities and individual airlines and others that will resonate absolutely resonate with chaos and the potential for damages, I think, and set this industry back. And again, this is a tens of billions of dollar industry that will transform the way that we travel and the way that we conduct commerce across the world. And I think as that reality sinks in, that's why I'm optimistic that we found the right solution. It's endorsed by the civil aviation authorities. The critical mass is forming, and the logic of this is, I think, pretty unassailable at this point. So cover me as an optimist on this one. So.
Thank you very much. Any other question from the floor? Comment, reaction? Well, I guess it brings us to the end of the panel discussion. We are only 5 minutes shy of the end period. I don't think I would be doing justice to anybody if I try to summarize what has been said over the last 1 hour and a half. But I think it's important to note that at least some things have come out in terms of commonality between what Europe and the US have going into the conference. We did not have perhaps an opportunity to hear from a number of the other regions. That is something which would perhaps have added some sort of flavor to the discussion. But I think the common aspects which were raised by the ambassador in terms of why you have the conference in the first instance, in terms of economic growth, in terms of science technologies, shaping the agenda for WRC-15 and so on. I think these are common elements that everybody going into the conference will be looking to. With regard to the details on what would perhaps be a very contentious, or could have been a very contentious issue, 1.1, I think there's some commonality that has, over the period, in terms of preparation, reached some sort of momentum. And I think the areas of divergence are now much narrower than where we were at the beginning of the cycle. Looking at the upcoming preparations for WRC-19, I think it's fair to say that in terms of 5G technology, it's an agenda item that everybody seems to have an interest in. In terms of the unmanned aircraft systems, against an area people are concerned. And I think maybe the debate that you may have coming to WRC-19 would be now moved away from the C-band to perhaps what frequencies are going to be used for 5G. And perhaps that will lessen the pressure on the likes of Gonzalo in terms of worrying what happens after. The issues raised about the UHF band, I think there was a very strong position from Europe. But again, in terms of what Ambassador Armstrong talked about in terms of flexibility for the countries, I think when people come back to look again at the amount of spectrum that is available and the value of identifying spectrum below 1G, again, there could be thoughts. I think maybe they are recollecting from the spectrum allocation, the digital dividend, which took place just a short while ago, and nobody wants to go out to start allocating a huge amount of spectrum again. But over time, that perhaps is another agenda item that will need to be looked at as we go to WRC-19. So from my perspective, I just want to thank the panelists. But before I do that, I would like to ask the President of EI if she would like to make some closing remarks on behalf of everybody.
I just wanted to thank the panelists, and in particular, Patrick. Thank you for really managing this discussion, which was wonderfully rich. We do look forward to seeing you after Geneva and up until 2019. So I thank you again. This is an area of absolutely key importance across all oceans, and having your knowledge and inform our understanding is capital. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you again. Let me give you my card. I think I'll see you tomorrow at while you're riding as well. Yes, tomorrow.